Oprah looked Jasmine Crockett in the eye and said, "This isn't what moral leadership looks like." But what happened next? No one in that room, not even Oprah, saw it coming. Jasmine didn't back down. She flipped the entire conversation, turned a challenge into a reckoning, and forced the whole room to see leadership through a new lens. The room had been quiet, respectfully quiet, as Oprah Winfrey took the stage, velvet seats filled with thinkers, leaders, and cultural icons. This wasn't a celebrity gala or entertainment panel. It was something far deeper, a national forum titled Morality in Modern Leadership, hosted in a grand civic auditorium under tall golden lights. People had flown in from across the country, dressed in suits and statement outfits, all eager to witness what many believed would be a generational conversation. Everyone expected Oprah to lead that conversation with poise as always. And, of course, she did it first. But what no one saw coming was that by the end of the first hour, Oprah would look across the stage at Representative Jasmine Crockett and ask a question so sharp, so direct that it would shift the entire atmosphere in the room. It wasn't shouted. Oprah never needed to raise her voice, but the words carried weight like thunder beneath silk. "Do you really believe this is what moral leadership looks like?" The pause that followed hit like a dropped pin in a cathedral. Jasmine Crockett sat on the other end of the stage, upright, still composed, but something behind her eyes changed. The cameras weren't rolling. There was no crowd roaring or booing, just a live audience stunned into silence. Everyone was trying to figure out had Oprah just challenged her personally. The context made it even more intense. Throughout the panel, Jasmine had spoken with her usual passion. She talked about injustice with the sharpness of someone who had lived it, not just read about it. She criticized political double standards, government inaction, and even the sanitized language that powerful people often use to describe deep societal pain. She had fire, but Oprah's question was clear. Was that fire too much? Was it dangerous? Was it moral? Jasmine didn't answer at first. Oprah continued gently but firmly. "You speak with force, Jasmine. You challenge. You shake rooms. But when people look to you as a leader, do they feel hope or just heat?" You could feel the audience shifting in their seats. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was a personal crossroads unfolding live, and no one could look away. Too many in the crowd. Oprah represented the gold standard, a self-made billionaire, humanitarian, and moral compass for decades. If Oprah questioned someone's leadership, it meant something. But that's exactly what made the moment so tense. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just any guest. She was a rising star, a congresswoman known for her raw voice, her sharp comebacks in congressional hearings, and her unfiltered defense of marginalized people. She was fearless but also controversial to some. She didn't fit the traditional mold. And now that tension was spilling into the open. Some faces in the audience seemed to brace for a breakdown. Surely no one could go head-to-head with Oprah in a moral conversation and come out standing. Surely this was the moment where Jasmine would either soften, retreat, or spin her words to smooth over the conflict. But Jasmine stayed silent for just a little longer. Not in fear, but in calculation. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift her weight. She looked at Oprah with an intensity that said, "I heard you. I'm just deciding how much truth you're ready to hear." It was a silence filled with power. Even Oprah seemed to lean back slightly, sensing that she had not rattled Jasmine. She had awakened her. In that quiet moment. The room transformed. What had started as a formal discussion was now an emotional battleground. Not angry, not violent, but real, personal, raw. And that's when it became clear Oprah hadn't silenced. Jasmine, she had lit the fuse. And Jasmine Crockett, unshaken, unafraid, was about to respond, not to defend herself but to flip the entire conversation. The silence was thick. People shifted in their seats, eyes bouncing between Oprah's composed face and Jasmine Crockett's unreadable expression. For nearly 10 full seconds, Jasmine said nothing. She didn't move. She didn't blink more than once. The air was frozen. And then, with the calm of someone who'd seen storms far worse than words, she stood. She didn't rush. No dramatic hand gestures, no scowl. She walked slowly to the center of the stage as if she were taking back control of the space. Not by shouting, but by showing she belonged there just as much as anyone else. Her voice, when it finally came, was low, and even I grew up in a neighborhood where the lights didn't come on unless somebody got shot. There was a murmur in the back of the audience. Not mockery, not discomfort, recognition. That's when the cameras showed up. That's when the city pretended to care. That's when the news vans parked on our blocks. When there was blood on the sidewalk, she paused. Not for effect, but because she meant every word. So, when I speak with fire, it's not because I want to scare people. It's because I've lived in smoke. I've watched mothers break down on porches while politicians held press conferences down the street and promised the world, then disappeared before the week was over. People started to lean in. This wasn't a speech. It was a reckoning. Miss Winfrey, I respect you more than I can say. Jasmine continued, turning directly to Oprah, who watched her without interruption. You opened doors for so many of us. You've been a voice of grace, strength, and clarity. But grace isn't always quiet, and strength isn't always smooth. The line landed like a soft hammer, not meant to shatter, but to wake. Jasmine's voice grew firmer. When I sit in Congress, I don't represent polished words. I represent people who are tired of dying while others debate if their pain is real. There it was, the heart of her fire. Not anger for the sake of attention, but for the sake of survival. You asked if I believe this is what moral leadership looks like. She said, let me ask you something. What does morality that sound like when you're screaming for your child and no one answers? What does morality feel like when you work 3 jobs and still get evicted? When you're watching your brother get locked up for something someone else got probation for? By now, the room wasn't just listening. They were absorbing her. Jasmine was standing in her truth. And in that moment, truth was power. I've been called loud, aggressive, disrespectful, she said, her hands calm at her sides. But I've also been called by mothers who had no one else to call. I've been called by teachers who needed someone to fight for their kids. I've been called by people who thought the system forgot them and they didn't ask me to. Whisper. A slow, steady silence took over the room, the kind that doesn't come from boredom, but from being stunned and to focus. Jasmine took a step closer to the edge of the stage. If we keep telling people that the only way to be heard is to speak softly and smile sweetly, then we're just asking them to shrink. And I won't shrink. Not for a seat, not for approval, not even for respect. There was something final in that sentence, but she wasn't finished. I'm not the kind of leader who makes people feel comfortable. I'm the kind who makes people feel seen. With those words, Jasmine returned to her seat. No mic drop, no grand finale. Just fire delivered with full control, full clarity, and full conviction. Oprah hadn't flinched. And, to her credit, she didn't try to interrupt or steer the moment. She listened intently, deeply, as did everyone else in the room, because what they had just witnessed wasn't a counterattack. It was a declaration. Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond to Oprah's challenge. She redefined it, and in doing so made everyone realize that morality doesn't always come dressed in calm voices and neatly folded hands. Sometimes it walks in with flame. For a brief moment it felt like the air had changed. Jasmine Crockett sat down, her posture upright but relaxed. Her point made with no apology and no retreat. The audience didn't clap, not because they didn't want to, but because no one quite knew what came next. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like truth, raw, uncensored, and too heavy to follow with polite applause. Then Jasmine did something no one expected. She turned back to Oprah, not with defiance, not with anger, but with a challenge of her own. I don't want this to be a battle of generations, she began, her voice low but unwavering. You've seen the world change in ways I can't imagine. You've carried burdens that women like me benefit from every single day. But if we're going to talk about morals, then let's talk about who gets to define them. Oprah raised her eyebrows, slightly intrigued. Jasmine leaned forward, eyes fixed on the woman across from her. The icon, the billionaire, the global symbol of strength and grace. You've spoken to presidents. You've dined with kings. You've interviewed victims and villains and visionaries. But let me ask you this, Ms. Winfrey. When's the last time you sat in a living room with a single mother who just got her water shut off? The question wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't cruel. It was surgical. Not for a camera. Not for a production, just to listen. No lighting, no scripts, just her and her story. That line struck something deep. Oprah didn't flinch, but her silence said she was processing and perhaps reflecting. See, I talk loud because the people I represent don't have the luxury of whispering. They can't afford etiquette. They can't afford patience. They need things fixed. Now, a wave of emotion rolled through the audience. What Jasmine was doing wasn't rebellion. It was reframing. She wasn't attacking Oprah's legacy. She was challenging the distance between legacy and lived reality. I grew up watching you, Jasmine continued. You inspired so many of us. You taught us to dream, but the dream looks different now. The system didn't just bend, it broke. And while some of us were told to fix it from the inside, others of us were handed the broom with the expectation that we stay quiet while sweeping up the pieces. Her voice was rising now, not in anger but in momentum. So when I raise my voice in Congress, when I refuse to sit down and smile while injustice stands tall, it's not because I lack morals. It's because I have them. Deep ones, ones that don't always sound pretty, ones that demand action. Oprah folded her hands in her lap, still silent, still absorbing. She wasn't scolding. She was listening, truly listening. Jasmine didn't stop there. I'm not trying to be your adversary. I'm trying to remind all of us that morality doesn't just come from experience and education. It also comes from survival. She pointed gently toward the back rows. There are young people in this room right now who haven't heard a politician say something that made them feel seen in years. I want to change that. I have to change that. And if my tone scares people into paying attention, then maybe they weren't listening to begin with. The audience was no longer divided. You could see heads nodding from the youngest activists in the back to the gay-head veterans of politics up front. It wasn't about choosing sides anymore. It was about waking up to the possibility that both voices, Oprah's and Jasmine's, had a role to play. Different tones, same truth. Then Jasmine softened her voice. Respect doesn't mean obedience, and unity doesn't require silence. Sometimes real unity starts with a hard conversation like this one. Finally, after sitting quietly through every word, Oprah nodded slowly. When she spoke, her voice was soft but full of weight. You're right, she said. Morality isn't one size fits all. And maybe I needed this moment just as much as you did. It wasn't a surrender. It was an acknowledgement to women, two eras, two different tools for the same fight. And in that moment, something powerful happened. The torch wasn't passed. It was shared. Asterisk for the first half of the evening. The audience had been sizing up Jasmine Crockett. Many arrived expecting to see Oprah offer guidance, perhaps even correction to a younger, more aggressive voice in politics. Jasmine's reputation had preceded her, bold, unfiltered, and sometimes controversial. To some, she was a rising star. To others, a symbol of everything too loud about this new generation. But now, the room was shifting. What had begun as subtle discomfort was transforming into focused attention. It wasn't just that Jasmine had held her ground. It was how she did it with clarity, with restraint, with a depth that made people look at her not as a rebel, but as someone carrying something heavy. The weight of real lives, real loss, real truth. And that weight had just landed in everyone's lap in the front row. A retired senator who'd been frowning most of the night leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, listening now with a different kind of energy. Not skepticism, not critique, curiosity. A young woman in the third row, no older than 20, sat with her hands pressed tightly together, eyes locked on Jasmine. You could see it in her face. She's speaking what I felt, but never had the words to say. One of Oprah's longtime collaborators, seated not far from the stage. Leanne toward her neighbor and whispered, "She's not attacking. She's reflecting the world she comes from." And that was the truth that was slowly settling over the room. Jasmine Crockett wasn't being defiant for show. She wasn't playing the part of a disruptor. She was telling the truth that people are often too afraid to speak in rooms like this. Rooms. Filled with power, prestige, and polish. She had turned the stage into a mirror and people were starting to see themselves in it. Oprah, ever the master listener, took it all in. She glanced across the crowd, noting the expressions, changed expressions, and then looked back at Jasmine. The exchange had begun with challenge, but it was no longer a battle of morals. It had become something much deeper, an invitation to rethink what morality even looks like. Jasmine had redefined the terms. In doing so, she didn't just defend herself. She brought others into the fold. She opened a door for those who never saw themselves as part of the respectable conversation about leadership. People whose voices weren't trained, polished, or approved, but true. That's when Oprah spoke again. Her voice was calm, but now there was something new in it. Humility. Reflection. "You know, I've spent decades trying to help people find their voice," Oprah said, turning slightly in her chair. "But maybe what I missed is that some voices were never lost. They were just ignored." The line hit the audience hard. It wasn't a concession. It was a realization, one that required someone with Oprah's grace to say out loud. She continued, "Jasmine, I may not speak the way you do, but I see now that your voice comes from a place I haven't lived in, and maybe I needed to sit here and be still enough to understand it." That was when the room, without planning, without signal, responded. A single clap dot, then a few more, then slowly a ripple of applause grew. Not thunderous, not explosive, but sincere. A sound not just of agreement, but of respect. Respect for Jasmine. Respect for Oprah. Respect for the conversation itself. One of the moderators, who had barely spoken during the tense exchange, stepped forward quietly and said, "This is what real dialogue looks like. Not safe, not rehearsed, but honest and that honesty had done something unexpected. It united the room. The older attendees weren't judging the younger ones anymore. The younger voices weren't dismissing the older ones as out of touch. There was a newfound understanding, not perfect agreement, but mutual recognition. In the back row, an older woman with graying locks whispered that girls got something special. And maybe in that moment Jasmine had done something few could. She had made a room full of strangers separated by class, age, and worldview. Stop comparing resumes and start listening to stories. As the final moments of the event unfolded, there was a shift not in who held the microphone, but in what the entire evening had come to represent. What began as a subtle confrontation between two powerful women, Oprah Winfrey and Jasmine Crockett, had evolved into something far more meaningful than anyone expected. It was no longer about who was right, who was loud, or who had the moral high ground. It had become a conversation about truth to different truths and the bridge that could exist between them. The moderator gave one last question. What does real leadership look like when the world is this divided? For a moment, no. One moved. Then Oprah slowly stood, the poise in her presence unchanged. But the tone in her voice shifted, more open, more vulnerable. "Leadership," Oprah said, "isn't about being the loudest or the softest. It's about showing up with your whole truth, even when the room isn't ready to hear it." She glanced at Jasmine, not as a critic, not as a mentor, but as a peer. "You reminded me tonight that sometimes those who come after us don't need our approval. They need our ears." It was a graceful admission, the kind that only someone truly confident in her own legacy could offer. But what stood out most was that Oprah wasn't stepping aside. She was stepping closer. Then Jasmine stood again. This time her expression had changed too. Not defensive, not guarded, open, grounded. "And I want to say this, Miss Winfrey. I didn't come here to fight you. I came here to speak for people who can't get into rooms like this. People who've been told they're too rough, too real, too much." Her voice lowered, and for the first time that night there was a touch of emotion in her eyes. Not fire. "But wait, I didn't get into politics to play the game. I got in to change the rules, but I also know this. I can't do that without standing on the workwomen like you already did. You didn't have to open the door, but you did. And now I want to widen it." The moment was honest. It was unscripted, and it was powerful. What made it hit so hard wasn't just the words. It was the recognition. This wasn't a battle of eras or egos. This was what generational progress looked like in real time. Messy, emotional, and necessary. Then the most unexpected thing happened. Oprah extended her hand toward Jasmine. Not just a handshake, a full grasp. Firm, mutual, symbolic. Two women, two worlds meeting in the middle. The entire audience rose to their feet. This time the applause wasn't cautious or unsure. It was loud, unanimous, cathartic. They weren't clapping for a winner. They were clapping for the truth that had been spoken loudly, softly, passionately, calmly, and for the rare moment of unity that had come from it. In the days that followed, people didn't talk about who got the last word. They talked about what those words meant. They talked about leadership not as perfection, but as presence, about morality. Not as something you recite, but something you live, especially when no one else in the room shares your struggle. And they talked about how sometimes leadership looks like being challenged and still choosing to listen. As the audience filtered out of the hall that night, one woman was overheard saying to her friend, "I didn't expect to see history tonight, but I think I just did." Because what Oprah and Jasmine proved wasn't just that two strong voices could clash and still respect each other. They proved that real change is messy, it's loud, it's uncomfortable, but it's also possible when truth is welcomed, not feared. And in that room for that one unforgettable night's truth wasn't just spoken, it was heard.